fog of thinking about war, not just war itself, but thinking about war. Judgments must be made in the absence of transparent, unassailable evidence. Evidence is interpreted, intelligence is gathered. There is, as present, general concurrence that the bellicose Iranian regime is working as rapidly as it can to develop usable nuclear weapons and the capacity to deliver them. So the regime, in the person of its inflamed president, Ahmadinejad, has already issued threats based on the presupposition that Iran will have in the near term functioning nuclear weapons. And one of the other issues, the new things in our world today, of course, is the fact that technology has radically eclipsed the time frame within which policymakers have to work. The relevant questions then turn in part on just how imminent the threat is. Do we have 10 years? Do we have 2? And more importantly, how do we act? Is acting to prevent Iran from completing its nuclear program ever justifiable within just war thinking? This takes us to the heart of prevention, namely a threat in situ that, if it is allowed to continue, will constitute a clear and present danger in the future. Now, the much debated and lamented, for many, Bush administration's national security document of 2002, although loath to use the language of preemption, does speak of the lawful use of military force in the case of an imminent danger of attack. Critics of this document insist that it violates, and does so egregiously, just war teaching. Supporters argue that it does not, and that although the proof turns on concrete cases and examples, there is no a priori interdiction on preventive use of force, and there the matter stands. Now, as if all this were not complicated enough, one must add another feature to this already heady brew, namely this articulated norm called responsibility to protect, or RTP. First issued under the imprimatur of the United Nations in the fall of 2001 and much overshadowed by the aftermath of 9/11, RTP has gained considerable headway in debates in Western Europe, although it has been less in play in the United States. I know I was surprised when I was in Edinburgh in 2006 and did, just off the book, so to speak, an informal discussion with people about just war issues, how much the RTP idea, how much weightiness it was given in the discussions there. One way or the other, the principle is that the United Nations has a responsibility to act in cases where the horrors being perpetrated are, and these are my terms, substantial, egregious, and continuing, and to act where the international community then has a responsibility to interdict in order to protect the innocent. Should the United Nations fail to act, and that has been a near certainty in the past, that may be changing, a member state or coalition of states may take this responsibility upon themselves under the rubric of RTP. Now, how do we evaluate this issue? How do we evaluate, in other words, particular political regimes and their actions? Now, I've discussed this responsibility to act under the rubric of international justice, arguing that a claim to the use of force in one's behalf, if one is the victim of systematic, egregious, and continuing violence, is a fundamental right, if you will, a rock-bottom claim that an aggrieved group may make upon the international community. Now, of course, the burden to act will fall most heavily on those who are capable of projecting their power, like the United States, but that, it seems to me, is neither here nor there as one sorts the matter through just war criteria, at least not until one gets to the prudential criterion and asks whether the intervention is likely to succeed or not. It makes little sense to expend human lives in an effort that is doomed to failure, even in the name of sparing lives. If one's actions will add to the loss of life, it is better to demur, even as one acknowledges the nature of the horror and the fact that basic human dignity is under siege. Now, with the distinctions between prevention and preemption in mind, let's turn to whether or not just war thinking affords a clear and coherent way of reasoning about these matters, or whether, as critics of just war claim frequently, just war criteria matter not at all in the final analysis, for each and every state will act in ways best suited to defend its own interests, whatever the right and wrong of it may be. Now, let's turn to justifications for preemption or prevention. Is it a bit warm in here? Are you feeling a little warm? I'm feeling a little warm, but is it a little bit? I thought, is it just me or is it? All right. Sorry for that brief outburst. I just wondered if you were getting as warm as I am. Walzer indicates that a major way in which his thinking has changed since the original publication of his classic work is in the matter of humanitarian intervention or rescue, hence where preemption may well be concerned. And he argues this in his collection of essays published by Yale University Press called Arguing About War. And it's a point that Michael also made in an exchange with students in my class on the just war tradition at the University of Chicago last year. That became a major topic of conversation. Is there another way to reason about preemption? Bear in mind that there is no legal right of humanitarian intervention in the United Nations Charter. Indeed, the UN Charter, as I noted earlier, leaves the full presuppositions of state sovereignty intact, prohibiting intervention in situations, under the legal jurisdiction of any given state. RTP, the responsibility to protect, although it does not have the normative force of the UN Charter, is a way to soften the prohibition on intervention without creating a permissive regime where such intervention is concerned. The bar against intervention within a sovereign state member of the UN, and one, as you know, must be a de jure recognized state to be a full-fledged member of that body, remains high, but it is not unassailable. That is, intervention cannot by definition be ruled out of court and counted more or less automatically as a wrongful act. It may or may not be such. The norm and its overriding turns on the occasion and its seriousness, its gravity. A border skirmish between contending parties within a state does not rise to the level of serious consideration of the use of force by an outside party. But a program of slaughter, systematic rape, rounding up children as child soldiers, and the like, clearly may rise to that level. And one example might be the actions of the notorious butcher Charles Taylor when he ruled Liberia and fomented internal strife in Sierra Leone that involved mass killings, mass raping, kidnapping children, turning 200,000 or so of them into drugged-out killers, and creating tens of thousands of displaced refugees. In cases such as these, consideration of preemption may begin seriously. Doesn't mean that one does it, but discussion needs to begin. I've argued under the rubric, I've argued this under the rubric of international justice and the use of force. And my basic claim, again, begins with the presupposition of equal moral regard for all persons, and that those being violated, once again, in systematic, continuing, and egregious ways, have a claim on the international community to intervene with force if necessary in their behalf. This does not trigger an automatic resort to force, but it opens it as a possibility, and some might say, in some situations, a moral necessity. Now, what lies behind this general approach is a set of Augustinian presumptions concerning the functioning of caritas, or charity, in the world of political entities. That translates into a notion of responsibility.